The Deep of Night game mode is essentially your hard mode in Elden Ring Nightreign, but the difficulty of this game mode doesn't necessarily just come from the fact that enemies have more health and do more damage, but it also does come in the form of these curses. Even though some of the relic perks and weapon passives can be a lot more powerful in this game mode, they typically would come alongside another detrimental side effect, which will take the shape of these debuff curses. And this does add another element in terms of the decision making, because sometimes you might have a really good weapon or a really good relic perk that you might have to pass up because it comes alongside a really detrimental side effect. Now, a lot of the curses that you do find in the relics, you can also find them in game via these weapon passives. There are going to be some unique ones between the weapon passives and the relic effects. But one thing to keep in mind is that if the curses are worded the same, the ones that actually come off the relic are always going to be a lot more dangerous than the ones that you can get in-game. But for today, we are going to go ahead and break down every single one of these curses for the relics and the weapon passives, and we are going to kind of rank them. It's mainly going to be split up into different segments or like tiers. I'm going to first talk about the curses that I would almost never use, then I'm going to talk about the ones that I would sometimes use, and the ones that I almost always use no matter what, because even though they're going to be downsides, they're not that big of a downside to warrant me not wanting to actually pick up like a really good weapon or a really good relic. But to start off with the curses that I would avoid the most, the number one being repeated evasions lower damage negation. If you do dodge like roughly 3 times in a short duration, you will take 35% more damage for the next 15 seconds. Now that is specifically for the relic perk. Now if you do find this curse on a weapon passive, you are going to take 23% or 30% more damage, depending if you have the +1 or +2 version, but it still lasts that same 15 seconds. And in this game where enemies can have long attack combos and you're spamming dodge, you're pretty much going to be getting hit a lot harder than you normally would throughout the entirety of a boss fight. Like the only time where I ever really cared to run this is with the Guardian, because a lot of the time you're just going to be blocking, although there are going to be a handful of attacks that you are better off dodging. And early game where your shield is not going to be upgraded and enemies are hitting you for a lot of stamina damage, you might have to do some dodging there too. So it could be okay for him sometimes, but like for every other character, especially the Duchess, never run this. But speaking of dodging and reducing damage negation, the one that just makes you take more damage directly after dodging, that one's also not going to be that good as well. Now this one is pretty much only going to apply like a second or two after you do finish your dodge. But if you do have the relic, you are going to take 45% more damage. And a lot of the time that you're getting hit in this game is because you've mistimed a roll and you're getting hit directly afterwards and getting hit for like roughly 50% more damage. Never going to be a good thing. However, if you do have this curse on a weapon passive, it's not going to be as bad because you're either taking 15 or 20% more damage. So if I were to find this perk with someone like the Guardian, as I mentioned earlier, being that you're mainly going to be blocking, this curse is not going to be that big of a downside. But one that's going to be a pretty big downside for everybody, especially the Guardian, is going to be all resistances down. If you find this as a relic, literally never run it, immediately delete it because it reduces all of your status ailment resistances by 80. Now, in this game, there are going to be many enemies that are doing status effects to you. However, there are going to be a plethora of curses that have you just take status effects by either just getting hit or not being at above 85% HP. And being how prevalent a lot of these curses are, more likely than not, you're going to be getting hit by some amount of status effect buildup. So having all resistances down pretty much means that you're going to be getting hit by those statuses a lot easier than you normally would. Now, when it does come to the weapon passive version, it's not going to be as detrimental. It's pretty much like half as effective. But even then, I still wouldn't really care to run it, especially with someone like the Guardian, because any single time that you're blocking elemental damage, you're technically taking damage and therefore getting hit for a whole bunch of status buildup. But I wouldn't mind picking up this weapon passive if I knew I wasn't going to really be fighting a status effect boss like Libra, or if I did end up finding a status effect resistance boost. Because yes, you can have some weapon passives that do give you that, and you can find them off powers as well. Another one that you should just avoid altogether, and if you find it as a relic, just sell it immediately, is continuous HP loss. This curse pretty much has you drain 2 HP per second, which early game is actually going to be a pretty big deal. But once you get later into the game, it's not going to really drain you from much health. However, one thing to keep in mind is that in this game mode, enemies are hitting really hard, and the most important perk to get is damage negation at full HP. And if you have damage negation at full HP, then you might as well stack up things like attack power at full HP. And yeah, continuous HP loss just pretty much negates the most powerful perks that you can find for this game mode. Now, with that being said, the Guardian would be a character that I wouldn't mind having continuous HP loss for. Now, I still would never have this for a relic, but if I did find a weapon with continuous HP loss, it's not going to be that bad, being that you're going to be blocking damage anyway, and if you're blocking elemental damage, you're going to be draining a bit of your health, and having perks like damage negation at full HP aren't going to be the greatest thing for the Guardian anyway. Okay, now getting into the next tier of like the curses that I would sometimes run, like they're not going to be the worst things in the world, and I only really would run them if I had them in combination with some like other really powerful weapons or relic perks. And the first one I want to touch on is lower stamina impairs damage negation. Now this one is just specifically on a weapon passive, it doesn't actually come with a relic. And how it works is that if you are below 50% of your stamina bar, you are going to take either 10 or 15% more damage, depending if you have the +1 or +2 version. Now, I was looking at a lot of my gameplay to try and figure out whereabouts I tend to get hit, whether it be like in the first half of my stamina bar or the later half of the stamina bar, and it was kind of even. So the way I see this relic is that about half the time that you do take damage, it's going to be about 10 or 15% more. Which, yes, is going to be a downside, but one, if you're going to get 2-tapped anyway, assuming you have damage negation at full HP, that 10 to 15% isn't going to be that big of a deal. But yes, there can be some times where it is going to get you killed, and like just half the time that you're fighting a boss, just having to take 10 to 15% more damage isn't going to be ideal by any means. But if I had this in combination with like a really powerful weapon, I wouldn't say no to it. Now, speaking of damage negation, the one that just makes you just take more physical damage is not going to be a good thing. The +1 version is going to be 5.5%, and the +2 version is going to make you take 8% more physical damage. And like 90% of the things in this game are going to be doing physical damage or split physical damage. Now, 5.5% is not going to be a crazy high number by any means, and as I mentioned earlier, once you get to like later depths and you're going to get 2-tapped anyway, it's not going to be the biggest deal. But one thing to keep in mind is that all these damage negation side effects do stack. So although if this is on a good weapon, you can't really have it in combination with a lot of other damage negation perks because it is a multiplicative buff, and with certain characters, you're going to be getting one-shot by even like the most random of trash mob. Now next, I want to touch on the reduced rune acquisition. This pretty much nerfs your rune gain by about 10%, so on most runs, on average, you might end up losing on about 50 to 60,000 more runes, which is pretty much like losing out on a level. So instead of finishing at level 15, you might be at level 14, or instead of 14, you might be at 13. Now you're gonna sometimes have games where you're probably gonna finish at level 15 either way with like 100k runes to spare. Yes, if you have like a very good team. And also there really isn't much of a difference at later levels as well. Like the difference between level 13 and 14 isn't that major. But the fact that this relic curse pretty much means that you just lose out on like a few percent more health and a few percent more damage is gonna be pretty annoying. Reduced damage negation for flask usages is another one to watch out for, because throughout the animation of consuming your flask, you can take up to 46% more damage. And that's pretty much going to be throughout the entire duration of the flask. Like I've had times where I've had this perk active and I went to go heal and I've actually gotten staggered out of my heal and taken that bonus damage too. Now the reason why I'm still sometimes going to run this is because as long as you are disciplined with your heals, it's not going to be the worst thing. Like one of the first things that you learn as like an Elden Ring gamer is that you have to heal when you have your opening, and you can't just be healing in random spots. And if you are that person, one, you're probably not going to get very far at all, and you definitely don't want to have this curse. But it can be annoying sometimes when like you're getting ganked by trash mobs and you just want to like back up and heal and you get hit from like a random direction and you just take a bunch more damage than you otherwise normally would. Now next up, I want to touch on ultimate art charging impaired. This pretty much just like decreases your ult charge by about 15%. So just like passive regen, or if you're getting a kill, if you're doing damage, anything that you do to typically build up your ultimate is just going to take 15% longer. Which in this game mode, ultimates can come in clutch so often, especially in trios when you can like use them to revive your allies, and potentially losing out on your ability to get your ultimate back a second time in a boss fight can be a big downside, especially if you have like a really good ultimate like the Wilder or the Iron Eye. But for some characters that don't really have as good as an ultimate, you can afford to run something like this. Or if you are a person that tends to hold on to their ultimate anyway, then it's not going to be like the biggest downside. But there's definitely going to be moments where you're so close to having your ultimate and you wish you had it and you end up dying. And it was all because of this perk right here. Another weird curse is near death reduces max HP. Now what this means is like when you get downed and you get revived either by a Wending Grace or by your ally, you're actually going to come back with less health. And if you have the relic perk equipped, you're going to come back with only 75% of your health, and this debuff lasts 60 seconds. If you have this on a weapon passive, it's actually only going to last 30 seconds. Now, the reason why this isn't so bad is because being that damage negation at full HP is like the best perk to run, having your max HP bar get lowered isn't going to be that big of a deal because the perk is still going to be active. However, one thing to keep in mind is that once the debuff does wear off, you are going to have to heal back up to full health because it doesn't automatically replenish your health. And also there's going to be a handful of times where you are going to get downed, especially in trios if you are fighting the Night Lord boss. And if every single time you're getting downed and you come back with a lot less health, that's going to be a pretty big downside because the Night Lord bosses are going to be the ones that do the most amount of damage. And that health loss could actually mean that you still get one shot even through damage negation at full HP. And also another thing to keep in mind is that these do stack. So if you have the relic and a weapon passive together, you're going to get revived with like half your health. Now, one curse that I'm kind of mixed on is having your flask restoration be reduced. Now, having this as a relic curse is going to decrease the healing flask by 15%. So instead of healing you for 60% of your HP bar, it's going to heal you for roughly around about 50%. Which if you have 6 to 7 HP flasks, that could be the difference of hundreds of HP that you're losing out on. Now, having this as a weapon passive is not going to be as bad because the +1 version only decreases your healing flask by 6%, which is pretty much nothing, especially because that the flask restoration boosting perks that you can find can give you like a 20 or a 30% boost. So yeah, 6% is not a big deal, and the +2 version is only 9%. But once again, keep in mind all these can actually stack together. So you don't want to have too many of them equipped, otherwise your healing flask is going to suck. Now, the last of the curses I want to talk about in this sometimes category is going to be poison or rot buildup when below max HP. Now, this can be on weapon passives and on relics. So do keep in mind if you have it as a relic, probably don't pick it up as a weapon passive too, because it's pretty much going to build up twice as fast. But the reason why this one isn't going to be that bad is because it's not just when you're below max HP. It's actually when you're below 85% health that these status effects start to build up. And as I've been mentioning throughout the entire video, and as I will continue to mention, damage negation at full HP is extremely important. So if you are below 85% HP, especially in depths 4 and 5, that is pretty much one-shot potential for most characters. Now, on the other hand, the reason why I'm not going to put this in like the almost always category is because there are going to be some times where you're not going to have an opening to heal for a while, and sometimes you get hit, and maybe for like the next 10 seconds, you're like running around dodging, trying to wait for an opening to heal, and in that instance, you get procced with poison and rot, and with a damage negation at full HP build, getting procced with rot and poison very much sucks. Like, there are some characters where this actually kind of feels pretty shitty to run on, especially the Guardian, because you don't necessarily need to stay at full health. But even then, the amount of times that you do get procced with status effects in this game mode is honestly not that high. Okay, but moving on into the next category or tier in terms of curses that I almost always run because they're not really that big of a downside anyway. Starting off with reduced maximum HP, FP, or stamina. These three curses can only appear on weapon passives, and I can put the numbers on screen for you in terms of how much they do decrease it by, which honestly isn't going to be that much. Like in terms of HP, you're only really losing roughly around about 5% of your health, which for early game, not going to be that big of a deal. But once you get later on into the game, it could mean somewhere like around about like 50 to 100 HP, which is pretty much the equivalent of a +3 Vigor relic. And that's only if you are at higher levels. If you are like at medium levels, like 5 to 10, it's only going to be like -2 Vigor. And that's for a character that actually has a lot of health. And when it does come to FP or stamina, this one is going to be a bit more situational. Obviously, if you have like a spell-based character, probably try to avoid the maximum FP decrease. And maximum stamina can be annoying, especially if you're playing someone like the Guardian, so do keep that in mind. Try not to have multiple of them, but it is only going to be like a 5 to 7% stamina decrease. Now, next up is impaired affinity damage negation. You do take either 5.5% or 8% more affinity damage, depending if you have the +1 or +2 version. And these values are identical to the impaired physical damage negation curses. But the reason why I'm not going to really care for this one much is because that affinity damage is very far and few. Most things in this game are going to be doing pure physical damage, and even if they do some elemental damage, it's only going to be like half elemental damage. And having the damage of that only get boosted by like 5% is honestly not going to be that big of a deal. And kind of staying on the same lines of that, ailments caused increased damage is also not going to be that big unless you end up going up against like Everdark Libra. But the amount of times that you are going to get procced with a status effect is going to be far and few, even if you do have the taking damage causer statuses. And yes, it is going to make you take roughly 30 to 40% more damage to that status effect. But for statuses like Frost or Bleed, Madness, that's still going to be like one healing flask worth of health anyway. And it's only really going to be detrimental when you talk about things like Rot or Poison. So if you have those in your build, then I would be more worried about something like this. Or once again, if you are fighting Everdark Libra, but you might be getting procced with Madness like every 3 seconds. Reduced damage below max HP, I'm also not going to really care much for in terms of like a downside, because the way that it actually does work is that if you're below 85% health, then it starts to kick in. And even then, it's only going to decrease your damage by about 8 to 9%. And once you get to those later depths, you should be at max health anyway, otherwise you're going to get one shot. Another one that's not going to be that big of a deal is damage increased by night encroachment. Now what this means is that the later that you get into the day, the more damage that you will take. And there is going to be a +1 and a +2 version. And the +1 version is pretty much nothing. Like at the end of day 1 or the end of day 2, you're going to be taking around about 4% more damage. But if you have the +2 version, then you're going to be taking about 10% more damage. But at the beginning of the days, there's not going to be any penalty at all. And also for day 3, there is pretty much no downside, to my knowledge at least. And that's pretty much going to be the biggest threat. And if you were to fight a boss at the end of day 1 or day 2 that is pretty challenging and you don't have much damage negation, then you can just remove the weapon and just pick it up afterwards. So yeah, I don't really think there's much of a downside to this one. And another weird one to talk about is attacks impaired on occasion. Now there is like a +1 and +2 version to this as well. And the +1 version has a 3% chance to just have your weapons or any attack just do no damage. And the +2 version is a 5% chance. And this pretty much goes to all of your attacks, your weapons, your spells, Ashes of War. Even your ultimate attacks can sometimes just do no damage if you have this perk equipped. Now, as long as I've used it, that has never happened to me. So I'm going to put it in this category. Now, the day that it actually does happen to me, it's going right to the bottom, because I'll be damned if I need to have a clutch ultimate and it does no damage. I'd be very mad about that one. But yeah, having a 3% chance of like doing no damage hardly ever comes up. So honestly, this can just be ignored for the most part. Now, another downside that I pretty much pray to always get on weapon passives is Night Tide damage increased. Out of all the weapon passive perks, this one is by far the most forgiving, because all it does do is just make you take more damage when you are in the storm. And if you're a player that has a tough time like managing the storm and running into the circle, then you're probably not going to make it very far in this game mode either way. Because for me, I played this game mode 100 times and I've yet to die to the storm a single time. Now, there has been some instances where I have been caught in the storm with this particular perk, but one thing that you can just do is just take it off. You can just remove it at any point if you're caught inside of the rain. All of the taking damage causes statuses perks is pretty much just a big bunch of nothing. Now, the taking damage causes death, as I mentioned earlier, can be a pretty big deal, because that's pretty much like having a second health bar to track. But in this instance, with the rest of these, even if you do have the status effect procced, it's not going to be that big of a deal. And even then, I've been running these particular relics for dozens and dozens of different runs, and I've maybe had a status effect procced against me like twice. And that only really happens at the earlier depths. Once you get to the later depths like 3, 4, and 5, if you're getting hit enough times to have the status effects procced, you're probably dead. Because as I mentioned earlier, these status effects isn't based on damage. It's just based on the amount of hits. So if you do go up against an attack that can hit multiple times in quick succession and not do much damage, then you're going to notice the build-up. Otherwise, these things are very much just non-existent unless you're playing the Guardian. If you're playing the Guardian, you just avoid these ones altogether, because any single time that you're blocking elemental damage, you're going to be taking status build-up. But for every other character, it's perfectly fine. Maybe it comes up like once every 10 games, but even then, it can be counteracted by like half a healing flask. Now, the last curses I want to touch on are the ones that just reduce your stats. Now, these will be specific to the relic curses, but the ones that will have like reduced strength and intelligence or reduced strength and faith, they're honestly not going to be that big of a deal, because they only reduce them by 3 points. meaning that if you have a strength build and you have reduced strength, you're only going to be losing out on like 1 to 2% more damage. Now, the biggest downside out of all of these is going to be the vigor, because it does decrease your vigor by 3, which obviously can be completely counteracted by a +3 vigor relic. So although not the biggest deal out of all like the stat dropping ones, this one is going to be like the worst. But thankfully it actually does come in combination with reducing arcane, which having your arcane be lowered is pretty much useless for like every single character, even the executor. Like, you're never going to notice the difference of -3 arcane. I promise you that. But any single time that you see these specific relics that decrease certain types of stats and you're worried about how it's decreasing the stat for a character that you like, just don't worry about it. It's only going to be by a couple % at most. Anyway, that is us now done with this one. As always, let me know what your thoughts and opinions are down in the comments below. If I did get anything wrong or if I've missed something, also do discuss it there. But if you do like what you see, please do like and subscribe, because we'll have a lot more videos coming out along the way. And definitely do follow me on Twitch if you haven't already, because I'm live there every day testing out different builds, doing different runs. So definitely do pop by if you haven't already. Anyway, catch you guys on the next. See yous.